the discussion about Bob Baffert in this industry has very, very little nuance. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on to talk about this in a nuanced way, because that's something you do very well in your Twitter threads. Baffert, when he gets brought up, he's either like Satan incarnate or he's the greatest trainer of all time, and everybody who criticizes him is just jealous and this and that. As someone who has the historical perspective and has seen tons of great trainers and prolific trainers along the way, just what's your feeling on Bob Baffert? A, the way he trains horses, and B, has he been a positive, overall positive or net negative, you think, for the game?
Interesting question. I think that taking the latter part of your question first, I don't think it's easy to say. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's just a personal view, I think that he's a net negative, because I think that he has been, in a very real sense, a poster boy for some of the biggest problems that have emerged in the industry over the last 30 or 40 years. One of those is what I like to call pushing the envelope. This is a big topic, and we could probably literally spend hours talking about it. But there is no doubt that Bob Baffert has pushed the envelope over decades when it comes to both medication and training horses hard. Mm-hmm. Now, he's not the first one to do it. Woody Stevens trained horses very hard and is widely considered to have been a great, great trainer. But with regard to the medication issue, Baffert's record is clear. I didn't really, when I was thinking about how to talk about these kind of issues on this show, I didn't want to weigh it down by reading off facts and figures. I mean, I can do that on the Twitter feeds, and people can, when I write posts on these issues, I'll back it up with the facts and you can read the facts. But the facts are out there. I've written about it many times. Baffert has been, and this is as kindly as I can put it, he's been an envelope pusher. Okay. I can also say, presumably without getting into trouble, that Baffert's career coincides with a real explosion of the use of cutting-edge performance-enhancing drugs. I'm not asserting that he necessarily was one of those, but his career coincided with it. Mm-hmm. And when you think about what that meant for the trainers like Baffert, who were either at the top of the heap or aiming for the top dog status on their circuits, there was an awful lot of incentive to join in, because the risks were very low and the rewards were very high. When I was first cutting my teeth in Chicago, and not just in Chicago, tracks everywhere around the country, the average trainers had somewhere between 15 and 40 horses in their barn. Probably the average trainer had 15 to 20 horses. Some had more, but not much more. And even what would have been the rough equivalent of a super trainer back in those days, like Woody Stevens, the excess horses that he had were not stabled in 3 other tracks in various places around the country. They were on farms waiting to come in when a horse broke down. Next one comes in. That's part of the reason he was able to be very hard on his horses in training. If they didn't last, okay, he's got 5 more promising ones with big pedigrees to come in, right? Mm-hmm. That's changed dramatically. And what we have now with the super trainers has been, I think, severely debilitating to the game. First of all, let's look at it through the lens of the bettors. Well, you have much smaller fields than you used to have. You have a much more compressed menu of races. And I'm not suggesting that these things are due solely to the super trainers, but it's a big part of it. Mm-hmm. If Todd Pletcher or Bob Baffert have 3 or 4 or 5 horses for a particular condition, they're not running them all in that condition. And those races frequently don't go. They'll go when their Baffert or Pletcher are ready, or Asmussen are ready to put their horses in, but not necessarily until they're ready to put them in.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I was growing up, and I went racing in New York as well, in the 70s and 80s, there were A other thans, two, not A other than optional claimers, A other thans, two other than allowances, three other than allowances, four other than allowances. Yep. And some of them were longer races, not sprint races.
Right.
And sometimes they were mile and an eighth, mile and a quarter, mile and a half on the grass, and so on. Those kind of races have all, but now, sure, we still have A other thans and two other thans, but everything else has pretty much disappeared.
Right.
And super trainers have played a real important role in that. So I mean, that's a real bee in my bonnet. And Baffert again is one of these, not the only one certainly, but he's a poster child for that. So for me, to address the question of whether Baffert is net negative or net positive, when you take into account especially all the cluster of deaths a few years ago, the huge number of positives that medication positives that he's had, his contentiousness when it comes to litigating the positive findings, all of those things I think have been negative for the industry. I'll let you come in again before. I mean, I could go on and on about Baffert, but I'll let you check in again.
Yeah, no, and Tink, I'm sure you know that one of the reasons why Joe and Patty and I wanted to start this podcast was because we made direct comments about Baffert and the team that he has, and that we weren't so eloquent as you are to say net negative, but in essence we criticized them, and because of that, we decided that it got censored, and we decided that we were going to start this podcast where we wouldn't have that kind of criticism if we feel like that there's an ill in the game that we want to discuss. And I've been very outspoken. Joe's been very outspoken about our feelings with Baffert. They're in line with what you've said as far as net negative. But I still believe that Churchill Downs is still harboring ill will towards Baffert with him embarrassing them in essence by having horses test positive in their biggest races. And they're kind of moving, in my estimation, they're kind of moving the goalposts on him a little bit. And again, I'm not a Baffert fan, but is it fair what Churchill Downs is doing as far as saying, we'll give you a 2-year ban? And then when he fought it a little bit, they said, well, you're a petulant child, we're going to give you another year ban.
Yeah, I will say that I agree that it is somewhat personal between Baffert and Mr. Carcinogen, if I'm pronouncing his name properly. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that anyone would have reacted poorly if Churchill had allowed him to run his horses in the Derby this year. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I have taken a little bit of a contrarian position on this issue online. And the reason is that Churchill Downs, I think, made it fairly clear that one of the big problems that they had was Baffert's unwillingness to accept accountability.
Right. Yep.
This is a clear pattern in his history. And for the first time, perhaps ever, in his long string of litigious reactions to medication violation suspensions and so on, Churchill Downs stood up to it, and Baffert to this day has not really taken full responsibility for it. Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind, I'm going to delve in a little bit of detail into why I think Churchill had a right to be really unhappy about how Baffert handled himself. Mm-hmm. The defense that Baffert and his expensive attorneys maintained for years in their efforts to to overturn or appeal the various suspensions, and of course to get their horse to be allowed to stand as the winner of the Medina Spirit, as the winner of the Derby. It was, I think, on close inspection, a really dishonest approach.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that because it was Audemax, that's their claim, by the way, really hasn't been proven, but that let's assume that it was. The idea that because that's how the substance got into Medina Spirit's system somehow was exonerating is, patently and obviously false. The rules in Kentucky were very clear, and it didn't matter how it got into the system. So, he not only didn't take responsibility initially, but he allowed his attorneys to string out the series of appeals over years and to go public with their claims, many of which were dubious, while Churchill basically had to remain mum in terms of their defenses. And even though they prevailed, as they should have, in court, it was abusive of Baffert to do that.
Right.
And I think, finally, that it's noteworthy that he didn't even come out in any way and say something that could be considered anything like an apology until after it was clear that he was not going to be able to run in this year's Derby. He then came out and essentially said, I want to thank Churchill Downs and the Kentucky Horse Racing Board for listening to our arguments, or something along those lines. Sort of a backhanded apology.
Yeah.
And so, that would have been the reason I'm going into the reason I've gone into this kind of depth is because I do truly believe that if Baffert at any point had come out and said, look, I screwed up. This is on me.
Right.
I'm sorry. I apologize to Churchill Downs. I apologize to fans of the game. I had, I should have seen this coming. No, he didn't do that. And that's why I don't really think that Churchill Downs was entirely wrong to extend it further.
Right. Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here. That's what I've said over and over again, that if he just apologized and took responsibility from the jump, none of this would have happened. And both things can be true. Churchill Downs is being petty, and he also brought this upon himself.